Welcome, fellow traveler, to phase 2 of the journey. The path to enlightenment begins from within and spreads outwards into the universe. As the universe is the manifestation of the essence of consciousness, no outward motion can occur without inward transformation. As such, it is up to you, the traveler, to unlock what awaits beyond the veil.
Looking out the window this evening, it's such a beautiful night outside. You can see the sky crystal clear, the Milky Way galaxy just looking gorgeous. And when you look up, you realize that the stars that we're looking at, our ancestors looked at the exact same stars, going all the way back to the beginning of time. And they created mythologies around these stars and the movements of the stars and the movements of the planets around us, and so on and so forth. And now we look to the sky, and with an elevated consciousness, we're able to understand better what the ancestors were telling us, what the ancients were telling us as well, what they left behind for us, etched in stone. Now we're seeing, with technology, different anomalies, like we discussed with Christopher Everard in the first hour of the broadcast. But right now, we have David Warner Mathisen on. He's been exploring the evidence that the world's ancient mysteries, scriptures, and sacred stories are built upon a common foundation of celestial metaphor. He presents this evidence in the new multi-volume series of books entitled Star Myths of the World and How to Interpret Them, as well as his previous books, The Undying Stars and the Mathisen Corollary. His latest installment of Star Myths revolves around the ancient stories of the Bible, and that was released this year in 2016. His website is davidmathisen.com. David, how are you doing, sir?
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for joining us. Very interesting work that you're doing here. One of my favorite things, as I said, to do is look at the stars, and so many different cultures have created these myths around the stars. I'm glad that you're tackling the Bible, because it's been my hypothesis for a long time that the Bible is the majority of the Bible is built upon astrotheology. It's all metaphor, and metaphor that we can really learn from, but metaphor nonetheless. How did you come to this line of research?
Well, yeah, thanks for having me, Chris, and I do think it's an important subject that a lot of people are interested in, and we can talk about astrotheology. There have been other people who have talked about this down through the centuries, really going back to Plato and probably before that, but we could explore some quotations, but it is not really something that I myself went out looking for. I was actually interpreting the Bible literally. I was studying the Bible pretty diligently. I think the verses in the ancient scriptures are, very beautiful and do have truths that call out to people, that make them attractive to people. Even in our modern era, there's a whole lot of people who are attracted to the different ancient scriptures of the world, including the Bible. And I was believing that they were supposed to be taken literally. And I didn't really have any desire to undo that belief. So it's something that almost came to me that I wasn't looking for. I was exploring some other concepts, things about the ancient ruins. You've talked about, written in stone in your intro there. I was exploring things about the pyramids, things that Graham Hancock had written, and Robert Bauval about the pyramids matching up with the stars. I was reading Hamlet's Mill. I've mentioned this and written about it in my blog and in various books, and how the authors of Hamlet's Mill describe us as living inside of what seems like a vast ancient ruin, like almost like a musical instrument. They use a variety of metaphors. One of them is like an ancient musical instrument we can tell it was for something, but different people have kind of speculated as to exactly how this instrument might have been played. Well, all that physical evidence around the world does give us a very compelling amount of evidence that there was some kind of ancient worldwide. You can see connections between the proportions of these different pyramids and ancient stone structures. You can see correspondences in where they are located on the latitudes. There's evidence that there was some kind of connection, that this is not just random sites. There was some kind of overarching ancient system that's now in ruins, and where lots of people are trying to discover exactly what it means.
Well, it appears to be a huge network.
Absolutely, it is. It is people have called it a worldwide grid. Joseph Farrell and his co-author, I don't have the book on hand, have written a book, I believe, called The Grid of the Gods, or something to that effect. And what I was driving at is that the myths are the myths that are found around the world are in parallel to this physical grid. We can also see evidence of a worldwide system in the myths of the world on every single continent in virtually every culture that you care to look at, whether it's Australia, Africa, ancient China, ancient Japan, connected to the same system that's working in the stories of the Bible, connected to the same system that's working in the stories of ancient Greece. That is very compelling evidence that we're looking at another aspect of the worldwide system. And really the first place that I kind of got an inkling of that was from the authors of Hamlet's Mill. That was written in 1969. And they talk about this vast worldwide system, and they do make reference to the myths encoding celestial knowledge, and they also refer to biblical stories encoding celestial knowledge. And I wasn't really open or super open to that idea that, well, the Bible stories are part of this same system, but I was familiar enough with the constellations, so all this, it's almost like it came to me, based on my own life history and the things that I had learned growing up. We can talk about the system of H.A. Rey, which I grew up looking at the stars using the system of H.A. Rey, and that's really important because the way he outlines the constellations opens the door to seeing these connections. And H.A. Rey is the author of the Curious George book. So I grew up with that. I had a very solid foundation in reading the scriptures of the Bible. I was very familiar with the constellations, spent a lot of time growing up, and then when I was in the Army, I was sleeping out under the stars a lot. So very familiar with the constellations. And then when the authors of Hamlet's Mill started to suggest this, and when they started to point to ways that the biblical stories also seem to be operating on this same system, I couldn't look away. I couldn't unsee it. As I started to see the evidence, I said, well, there's some evidence there. That's pretty strong, but maybe that's a coincidence or maybe it's a one-off. But because I knew a lot about the scriptures, as I looked more and more, I started to see it's just like solving any mystery. You try different patterns, and when you find the pattern where all of a sudden all the evidence starts to fit, you have to say, that framework or that template seems to encompass and make sense of an awful lot of evidence that wasn't making sense with the other template.
Well, it's like one of those photos that you look at and you can see the object. At first, you can't see it, but once you see the object or picture or hidden whatever it is inside of it, you can't unsee it. It's almost as if some veil has been lifted and you've stepped right beyond it. We'll be right back. Much more. We're going to get into Adam and Eve right on the other side. you go to davidmathisen.com, the website is perfectly laid out to follow along with what we're talking about this evening. There's so much to get into, the shamanic information, the Egyptian information, and I want to jump into those a little bit later in the broadcast. But David, your latest book, obviously, about the Bible. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Shortly after, he created Adam and Eve. You're not going to tell us this is all just star myths, are you?
Well, I don't know. What is just star myths? Because something is a myth does not necessarily mean that it is not true, that it's not conveying truth. Some people, and myself included, when I took the stories literally, I would have been very resistant to someone saying this is just a metaphor. But it does not necessarily need to be literal history in order to be true. Now, I know there's a whole lot of maybe listeners who would object to that, and
David, let me say this: this broadcast is stained with the blood of many sacred cows. So, speak freely.
Well, I think it's a very foundational story. It's quoted in the New Testament. It's cited, in other places in the Old Testament. It has been used as cover or intellectual, attempt at justification for saying, well, the husband must rule over the wife because in this judgment that's passed upon Eve, it's told she's going to have multiplied pain in giving birth, and also that your desire is going to be for your husband, but he will rule over you. Actually, the text there is not extremely clear. There's some words that were added in the translation based on what the translators, they're trying to make it make sense in the English syntax. But this is a very foundational story, and I'll tell you that it is based. I'm very convinced that the evidence is overwhelming that this is based on celestial constellations that you can see. So astro-theology that you mentioned in the first segment is this whole idea that the scriptures, and it's usually talking about the Bible. I would say that astro-mythology might be a better word, but we won't get into quibbling over that. Some people are familiar with this from, things like Zeitgeist or other authors have written about this. A lot of times they're talking about the motions of the sun through the solstices and equinoxes, which is definitely part of it, but that's just really the tip of the iceberg. When you get into the specific constellations, and we can talk more about why that's really important, then I believe it really helps to unlock what is going on in this or that ancient myth. Because I believe these are really sophisticated, profound, beautiful stories that were intended for our benefit, but when we try to force them through a literal lens, as I was just alluding to a little bit with the Adam and Eve story, you can take it, or it has been misinterpreted in all kinds of ways that end up with oppression of, sexism or racism. These things have been falsely used to justify slavery or oppression, colonialization, imperialism, all kinds of bad things that we can, look at in history that's not really disputable. But I think that's a function of listening to them in a language that they're not really speaking. They're not speaking a literal language. They're speaking a metaphorical language.
So the big question, obviously, is what were they telling us with the Adam and Eve story? I mean, here we have two beings walking around a tree. You've got a serpent coming down. What's the symbolism?
Yeah, so let's talk about what I think. You mentioned in the very beginning intro how beautiful it is right now. You can look outside and see the Milky Way. This is actually a very special time of year, and especially when the moon isn't really full, is a great time to go out and look. But right now, people can go out and see the Scorpio and Sagittarius side of the heavens in the evening, rising up, and the brightest part of the Milky Way is between Scorpio and Sagittarius. And then in the morning hours, if you get up at 4:30 or 5 a.m., you can see the beautiful constellations of Orion, it'll just take your breath away if you go out right now at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. And Orion is really on the opposite side of the, it's 12 hours apart basically from Scorpio. Okay, well, let's get back to Adam and Eve, because Scorpio is actually a serpent figure in many myths, but there's a couple other serpents nearby. I believe that Eve is almost certainly associated with the constellation Virgo, and Virgo is the Virgin. She has an outstretched arm. It's one of her most distinctive features. She's actually not an extremely easy constellation to see, but she leads Scorpio in the sky. Scorpio is very easy to see, and also you have Mars and Saturn right nearby Scorpio right now. Scorpio is a really dominant figure in the night sky, really beautiful, massive, serpentine, very graceful serpent-like figure, and he plays a dragon, he plays a scorpion, he plays the nine-headed Hydra that Hercules or Heracles fights in Greek mythology. And Virgo is in front of Scorpio. Actually, Libra is in between the two in the zodiac, but Libra is also a pretty faint constellation. But getting back to, I believe that Virgo, with her outstretched arm, that's why it's Eve who takes the fruit, because she has an outstretched arm in the sky, and then she's the one who offers it to her husband. It's not because women in general are more easily prone to temptation, although that's, if you read like the King Arthur stories from the Middle Ages, and this is the way this myth has been applied, like, it's, the women is the root of all evil because women fell first for the serpent's tricks, and then, Adam really throws her under the bus when he's approached by God and says, "Hey, who ate from this tree?" He says, "Well, she gave it to me." Well, she's reaching out with her arm in the sky. There's a specific star called Vinda Meatrix, which is one of her brightest stars. It's her second brightest star, and that is an important star. But she's reaching out and actually towards another constellation, Boötes, the herdsman, which is probably Adam. He's over her in the sky, and actually some of the verses reference that, and I believe it has more to do with their positioning in the sky than anything to do with, the man needs to be reigning over the woman. That's a misinterpretation. So if you take it literally, you can go all kinds of, I believe, wrong directions. But if you look at the constellations, there's a serpent right underneath the woman, a long constellation called Hydra. It's one of the longest in the sky.
Well, you know what they say, David. As above, so below. We'll be right back.
Welcome back, traveler. Take a deep breath and relax. As we continue to journey deeper beyond the veil.
Now, David, I want to fast forward to the time of Jesus, and I wish we had more time. We should do a 6-hour broadcast tonight, because it seems like every guest for every hour we need much more time with, so we got to get you back on for 2 full hours at least. But right now, the myth of Jesus, how does that relate to looking to the stars?
Yeah, so I'll just say that I do have some videos that I've made about Adam and Eve, so people can check that out. And we didn't really, I gave like one constellational clue, but there's many, many others. But I would say, in answer to your question, that really you can get to the answer from any one of the myths that we look at. What happens with Adam and Eve is they get thrown out of the garden, right? they get cast out of paradise. Well, they sink down into the western horizon. I'll get to the Jesus question in a moment. But,
well, let's keep it going with Adam and Eve.
Yeah, well, and we can tie it in because actually there is a prophecy or it's sometimes called the proto-gospel that's given in Genesis 3:15, I believe is the verse where the Lord says to Eve, hey, your pain in childbirth is going to be multiplied greatly. Okay, now the constellation Virgo has her, she's actually lying on her back with her feet up in the air. This is from a northern hemisphere perspective, which is, where the lands where we traditionally think of the Bible is coming from. It's really worldwide, but they're in the northern hemisphere. If you or I, if we're in Australia, should be facing the other way. But here in the northern hemisphere, she's on her back with her feet elevated and her feet apart. Now, if you've ever been, in a delivery room, that's what happens when a woman gives birth. She's got some, like the stirrup chair to push against. Looks like she's giving birth, and actually Scorpio is down there, positioned in the sky. So in some myths, like some of the myths of the Pacific and Maui, she gives birth to a child who has 8 heads, and she's horrified. Maui is sometimes described as having 8 heads. That's because Scorpio is right there. Well, in that casting out of the garden scene, she is told, I will put enmity between your child or your seed, the seed of the woman, and the seed, actually when the serpent is cast out, God says to the serpent, I'm going to put enmity between, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. You will bite his heel, he will crush your head. This is pointed to by, New Testament theologians who say, this is a reference to what's going to happen in the New Testament. Jesus is going to be crucified. That's bruising his heel. He's being, stung by the serpent. But in that same moment, he's going to crush the power of the serpent forever, or, the power of evil. It's a reference to the crucifixion. Well, yeah, it is a reference to the crucifixion because it is the same stars in the sky. If you read, you referenced volume 3 is my latest edition in the Star Myths of the World series, and it does go into the crucifixion and the celestial components that I believe are probably underlying that. But in this visual of the scorpion looks like he is biting or bruising the heel of a constellation that's directly above the scorpion, and you can see this constellation in the sky. It's a very large constellation called Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. He's actually, or she, some people think that Ophiuchus might have been the 13th zodiac that was kind of thrown out by the kind of patriarchy that wanted to get rid of kind of the more lunar numbers, 13 and 14 being more lunar, 12 being more solar. Anyway, that's another direction we can go when we have 2 hours. But the Ophiuchus is standing on the scorpion's head. Scorpio is bruising the Ophiuchus's heel. This is what that Genesis 3:15 is referring to, and it's got all kinds of all these things have spiritual meaning. So when the Adam and Eve and the serpent, all three of them get thrown out of the garden, and they're addressed in this order. First, God talks to the serpent, says, you're going to go crawl on your belly and eat dust. Well, right underneath Virgo is Hydra. He does look like, as he reaches the western horizon, he looks like he's crawling on his belly and eating dust. And I put a picture of that in a star chart. You can look on any planetarium software online and see that, move him to the western hemisphere. You'll see that. He goes out first. Then the Lord addresses the woman. She gets cast out second. Well, Virgo is the next constellation that disappears beneath the western horizon. Then finally Adam, God says, you're going to return to the dust from whence you came. Well, that's because he came from the eastern horizon. He sinks down into the western horizon. And just as he's sinking down in the west, in the east is rising another constellation called Perseus. That's one of the beautiful constellations you can see in the morning if you go out right now at 4:30 or 5 a.m. and see the Pleiades, Orion. Perseus is right above the Pleiades. Perseus is the angel with the flaming sword that turns in every direction, and I've got some diagrams in the book and in other places. I'm not the first one to suggest this. An 19th century preacher in the 1830s named Robert Taylor talked about this in England. He's got a hand that seems to turn kind of in a curling motion. That's talking about the flaming sword that turns in all directions, and that constellation is rising in the east, just as Adam, Eve, and the serpent are getting thrown out in the west. And where does the text says that God puts this angel or cherubim with the flaming sword in the east of Eden? That's because Eden is the paradise of the stars. So to get into what does all this mean, and it's the same for the New Testament, they dramatize this over and over, like, hey, if you didn't get that story, let me give it to you a different way. It has a lot of layers of meaning, but one of the big things is this cycle of between spirit and matter. You referenced as above, so below. The stars, I believe, we could talk about lots of different varying theories, but I believe that the stars are a way of visualizing the invisible world. You can't see the invisible world, the other realm, the dream time, the shamanic realm, but it is real. And what they're saying with as above, so below is, hey, here in the material world, you need to pay attention to the invisible world and to the spiritual part of yourself, because it is actually real. And you're actually down here, you're supposed to be connecting. You actually have a higher self. You need to connect with your higher self. Your higher self is trying to help you out. Sometimes you're like, ooh, I don't know where that idea came from, or I kind of got this like weird warning in a dream, or I got this intuition that I shouldn't do that. I don't know where it came from. Well, guess what? That may be what the ancient myths are talking about. There are all kinds of dramatizations with Jesus is the Christ within. Paul talks about this. You have a higher self. You have our ordinary self. We're supposed to start awakening to the other realm, and it actually has practical implications in this realm. One of the best stories is Solomon. He's approached by God in a dream and given wisdom from the other realm, and then in his day job as a king, the very next scene is him exercising that wisdom in his famous Judgment of Solomon scene, where he's in court and he's having to adjudicate these knotty problems, these difficult dilemmas. You know, these two women bring their babies, and he has to sort through it and come up with the right answer, and he comes up with an inspired, I believe it's also celestial metaphor, can be shown to be celestial metaphor, but it's a dramatization of, look, you need this other wisdom to function in this world.
Well, David, that's why I wanted to fast forward through the Bible stuff, because I want to rewind back to Egypt, because I think that's where the real consciousness lays. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We will journey to the pyramids and our ancient ancestors right on the other side. Mathisen.com, the website. And David, I just want to compliment you on your website again. It's laid out so perfect with so much information. If you don't mind, if we can fast forward to Egypt, maybe we can start with the zodiac wheel and the soul and get into Isis and Nephthys stories. Maybe we can touch upon Osiris, Anubis, the usual suspects. Please take us away.
Yeah, great. No, I think that's a profitable line of inquiry. I will say that thanks for the compliment on the website. I don't know, I'll just give to the listeners also, there is a newer website I might not have given you, or it's called starmythworld.com. People can also go there, but I think there's a link at davidmathisen.com. I think I have put links on all my older websites pointing to that one too. But in any event, there are connections between all these myths around the world, and I think one of the important things to understand is this really unites humanity, or it should unite humanity. It's not like one set of scriptures is right and everybody else is, in such degraded error that we need to go around and get them to switch to our system. That, unfortunately, has been, a theme of history and continues in some cases and can be seen to be kind of like, well, it excuses going around and telling people you need to stop doing things your way and start doing them our way. The celestial metaphor can be very clearly seen to be operating around the world, and there are strong parallels between the myths of ancient Egypt and the Bible, but also, which I was surprised at how many parallels I found between the Greek myths and the Bible. The story of the Odyssey has so many New Testament parallels. It's quite astonishing. In Volume 2 of my series, I really love the Odyssey and Iliad and the ancient Greek myths. It's all about the Greek myths, but you'll see that there's lots of, and I believe it's because they're all using the same system. It doesn't necessarily mean that Egypt went around the world in boats and gave their system to everybody. I think it's possible that there was some very ancient system that all around the world, the descendants of that system can be seen to be related to each other, but they didn't necessarily talk to each other. They're all descendants from some common ancient source that we don't know. Okay, so now with that intro, the Egyptian myths and gods and goddesses are found in some of the most ancient texts that we have today. I mean, we found now there's Göbekli Tepe, but there's not extended, at least as far as I believe we've found so far, there's not extended texts at Göbekli Tepe. There's amazing architecture. Who knows how they made these 30-ton stones and then buried all these things, in deep sand, and the carvings are exquisite. But the pyramid texts that are inside some of the Fourth Dynasty pyramids and other extended texts from ancient Egypt give us some of our first glimpses. And even those, it's pretty clear that the system was so well developed by then that they didn't even need to really spell it out. They just referred to it like everybody should know about Osiris or Isis. Okay, so Osiris is most people know the god of the underworld. He's, I believe, the sun on the underworld journey. And it doesn't mean that they believe that the earth was flat. There's plenty of evidence that actually the ancient Egyptians have very sophisticated understanding of the size and shape of the earth, including the dimensions of the pyramids seem to reference the size and shape of our spherical earth in different ways, and different people have written about that through the centuries and decades. But Osiris is the sun on the underworld journey, I believe, and Horus is the sun on the above the horizon journey. He's the hawk-headed falcon god who soars up above, or falcon-headed. He soars between the two horizons. Horus of the two horizons. He's the sun in the sky. Well, these two parts of the cycle. It's a daily cycle. It's also an annual cycle. There's part of the year where the days are longer. There's a part of the year where the nights are longer. These are talking about spiritual things, I believe. And the underworld journey, the Osiris journey, is the one we're in right now. We're down here. We all, you and I, as far as I know, have physical bodies. I haven't met you in person, but I bet you have physical bodies. You probably have indoor plumbing at your house. You got to take showers and,
I think I have a physical body, but it could just be a manifestation of my consciousness.
Well, it's possible. That's a great question. We could spend hours on that too. But it's possible that we come down into this world with this physical body to learn things that you can't learn if you're just a spirit. Maybe a spirit can't have sex, or maybe a spirit doesn't have to wrestle with, I don't know, a toothache or whatever. So,
beings have come down before because of the daughters of men, so maybe that's the reason.
Well, I think that's celestial too. That's another story. But absolutely, yeah, all these things are actually talking about, hey, listen, you're in this underworld journey, but you've got to identify. It's pretty easy to know you've got a physical body. Most of us kind of start to, we find our toes when we're a baby, and then we start to, find our nose, and then we find our ears. We know that. The part we have to remember is that we've got a spiritual side. And so the Jed column or the Tot column or the backbone of Osiris is depicted as being cast down and thrown down into the underworld, and he's sleeping like a corpse, but he's revivified. And Isis is the one who goes and finds him. She searches all over the world for this. Osiris has been murdered by his brother Set. You can read about it, and Plutarch's a very important ancient philosopher, and in fact, that's the source for the I believe the first quotation probably that we have about the veil of Isis. You have named your show Beyond the Veil. And we could talk about the veil of Isis. Plutarch refers to, no man has ever lifted my veil. There's this statue that he talks about in a place called Sais or Sais. The Egyptian word was Zau, I believe, is the name of the city. It's in Lower Egypt, which is actually northern Egypt. And there was a statue of Isis. He talks about there was this inscription that no man has ever lifted her veil. The veil of Isis is what that veil, and then, later medieval, magician theory and stuff talks about opening the veil or going beyond the veil. This is talking, we could talk for hours about what it could mean. But
you're disclosing the mysteries here, David.
But actually, this is a great point. See, I believe Schwaller de Lubitsch is John Anthony West. Oh, I got to mention, I'm going to be at a conference with John Anthony West here at the end of this month, September 30th, October 1st and 2nd, down in Southern California at the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. Robert Schock is going to be there, Scott Onstadt, Walter Cruttenden, Carmen Boulter, a lot of other speakers there. But
excellent. Where can people check that out? Because we are just about out of time.
Yeah. Oh, it's on. The letters are CPAK, Conference on Precession, CPAC, Precession and Ancient Knowledge. But we'll have to talk more about Isis and Nephthys, the two mothers. Symbology is really, really important. And it's
David, let's do this. I'm going to have Cherie send you an email to book you for 2 hours in the very near future. We are unfortunately out of time, so thank you very much. We should have had you on for 2 hours initially, so don't go anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. Coming up, Nano Girl Sharon will be joining us.
www.beyondtheveilradio.com.
You must unite what has been set asunder.
We are TFR, Truth Frequency Radio.